So I think we'll just hand it over to Aidan Scott to speak with us. So thanks again, Dr. Flanagan.
Thanks so much. Hey, folks. Great to meet you all. Meet. We never refer to this as meeting people. So maybe that's ironic. We're talking about loneliness over Zoom, but also potentially a fantastic facilitator. I was super glad that I was able to catch a little bit of that end of Dr. Flanagan. Really insightful to see that national scale and some of the strategy around loneliness. Definitely going to take a very different tone for our conversation. Going to go a little bit deeper and talk more explicitly about mental health, because I believe we can't talk about loneliness and not talk about mental health. Certainly, prolonged loneliness has significant evidence on its impact, negative impacts to our mental health. And myself personally can relate to that. And I want to definitely get into and talk a little bit about my lived experience and how I used my lived experience to go and become a change maker in this space of mental health. And then we want to really talk about some tangible examples that I've seen throughout my work, some successful, some not so successful. And then we'll ground all of the conversation into some tangible next steps and some discussion on, as you move forward into this battle of the brands, what are some considerations you might want to make when going about crafting your potential solution. So, in the most personable way possible, let me throw on screen share so that we all go to small faces and stop seeing each other quite as much. But let's jump into it, because I know our time is limited, and I know that I have that great pleasure of being the speaker right before lunch, which is always the best time of day to be a public speaker. So my segment, if you didn't have a chance to look at the titles, we're talking about building with us. We're going to talk a lot about collaboration. We're going to talk a lot about respecting and inviting in expertise of people with lived experience into our solution making. So perhaps like some of you, my story starts out in the suburbs. I enjoy that I chose an Unsplash photo from Australia. I wish that these were my suburbs. I grew up not too far away from Vancouver, actually, in a little city called Chilliwack. If you've only lived in Vancouver, then your only familiarity with Chilliwack is probably on your way to Kelowna, a much more exciting city, I will say. Chilliwack's where you get gas before you start going through the mountains. And it smells a little bit like farmland, because there's a lot of it there. Can attest, did live on a farm at some point when I was growing up as a child. So I was a true blue Chilliwack native at that point. And my story of loneliness really starts with something that is really complex, and definitely we don't have enough time to go into it. As a child, I went through some very, unfortunately, common occurrences. My parents got divorced. Unfortunately, how my parent responded to the stressors of going through divorce was very detrimental to my childhood and my youth. I am a survivor of childhood abuse. And I went through child abuse really from age 8 straight through to my grade 12 year of high school, both physical and sexual abuse in my home. Which that is a whole other conversation on itself, especially as a male voice in this conversation. But for our conversation on loneliness, why I mention this is I very much lived in the shadows. There was what you saw if I went to school and engaged in community. I was still in sports. And then there was this reality that was happening at home. And when I dive into the topic of loneliness, I think for so many that are struggling with loneliness, even if they don't have that trigger of abuse, they very much might find themselves in a very common situation. With remote work proliferating during COVID, we saw lots of colleagues move to Zoom, and we see them sometimes just like this, and they look similar. If, like me a few months ago, I had a lot longer hair, but you wouldn't know that my mental health was degrading. You wouldn't know that I'm increasingly feeling lonely. And so it's really hard to reach somebody there. And I share this story to invite us into a consideration of a continuum, a spectrum that we talk so often about in mental health care. And it applies to loneliness. It applies to all of us, really from a place of flourishing. If you want to think of your health, that would be a very great place in your health. You're flourishing, you feel confident to be outgoing, you feel connected, you have the right tools and you have the right systems around you to be a healthy individual. And then you have the other side of that spectrum, which is languishing, may lack tools, may lack resources, may lack connection. So for me, my loneliness story starts in a digital world. I was a youth at the time now, still experiencing this ongoing abuse, and I sheltered away in Azeroth. For those of you who aren't geeks, I don't blame you. I played a lot of World of Warcraft to the point that it became very unhealthy. I notably played 72 hours straight when a new expansion came out, which was a bizarre experience in an online community like World of Warcraft, because I was both applauded by other hardcore geeks like myself that like, oh my goodness, you got to level 70 in 72 hours, you machine. And then other people who took the time out of their day to tell me that I was a terrible loser for doing such a thing. Interestingly, here I had a digital connection. I had community in my guild and other people that I gamed with on a regular basis. But what I struggled with in that community was the superficialness of it all. We were connected because we had a pursuit in the game, but rarely did we connect in a more meaningful humanistic level. And interestingly enough, it was at the very end of what I would call my World of Warcraft career, when everything in my life really hit the fan. And actually it was on an eve of a hospitalization. And I remember being online and talking to my guild. We're going into a raid, which again, so much geek talk going on right now. If you're not familiar, this is like 40 people getting together to do this big event. And I was like, hey, I'm not feeling so great. I can't make it. And I was explicit with like, oh, I'm headed to the hospital. And for 15 minutes after I said that, when I was finally vulnerable on like, I'm not okay, something's going on, we actually had a really humanistic conversation around what was going on. And for 15 minutes, I felt connection. For 15 minutes, I felt less lonely because I could break down these barriers that I had built up around myself to protect myself and really connect to other people. So this story, of course, does have a happy ending. I'm still here today. I always think it's important to say so many young people that share common stories to mine, unfortunately, aren't here today. I'm not that old, 35, but a lot of my peers who have common experiences struggle with things like substance use, who've lost lives to suicide. If they're still here, they might still be at a place that they're not talking about this. They still haven't been able to access supports about it. So often during my recovery, I would interact with guys in their 50s who would talk about like, I just got divorced and this is my first time that I'm talking about the abuse that I experienced as a child and this trauma that's lived with me for my whole life and disrupted my professional career, my social career, and now my intimate romantic career or career. Don't tell my wife that I said that. Career husband. The painful impacts that can have. And so for me, what turned things around first and foremost was community within folks with lived experience. I leaned into advocacy and public speaking early in my recovery, had the fortunate opportunity to get to speak to so many schools, in particular and high school students, and talk to them about mental health, talk to them particularly about abuse and talking and supporting that particular challenge. And from there, that passion really continued to grow. I was like, there's a lot wrong in healthcare when it comes to mental health. We are not talking about it enough and we are not supporting it enough. And so I wanted to do more than just be an advocate. It was really at this cusp. This would have been, like 8 or 9 years ago now, but there was this wave, if any of you remember, like mental health really started to come into the spotlight. There was a lot more conversation about it. Bell Let's Talk started to roll out and some of these bigger campaigns, and we'll talk about Bell Let's Talk actually in a moment, specifically pros and cons. but I always felt limited because advocacy, bringing awareness to mental health, we talk about this two-sided sword that it kind of represents. If I inform you about mental health and challenges of mental health, but at the same time, there isn't a service to pick you up, if there's not a resource that you can plug into, you're kind of left floundering a little bit. It's like, well, great, thanks, Aidan. Thanks for telling me there's a problem. I now don't know how to solve that problem. And I think that's really important as change makers yourself here today, thinking about solutions in the matter of loneliness. Where are you going to fall on that spectrum? What is that audience that you want to work with? For me, we went really deep. We went specifically into the care relationship. And that's what we do at Spebox, which I really won't get into a whole lot. But we provide electronic medical record technology to private practices and community mental health organizations. And what's really unique about our solution in an area of technology that's always about back office and always just about operations of clinical organizations, our platform connects patients to their healthcare providers and gives them a voice in their care, as well as giving them continuity of care because they actually become stewards of their health data and their health data is able to move around the system. So we're combating loneliness at that point of care to help that patient not feel like they're alone and that they're isolated. We're empowering them with tools so that they can really take charge of their care and feel deeply involved in their care rather than have care seemingly done to them. We hear this so often in mental health, and we hear this from upstream populations that might just be struggling with loneliness, that they often feel like an intervention is being done to them, but not collaboratively with them. So let's jump into some tangible examples here of some campaigns that many of you might be familiar with and some organizations you might not be familiar with. We're all Canadians here, and so we're very familiar with Howie. Love Howie. Definitely seen his face a lot in Bell Let's Talk campaign. And I want to talk about Bell Let's Talk first, not just because it is probably the most publicly known mental health campaign across Canada. If you were strictly looking at it from marketing metrics, you would say Bell Let's Talk is the most successful campaign across the country. And for those of you that may be slightly less familiar with Bell Let's Talk, it's a twofold campaign. It's the public campaign on the 28th or around the 28th every January that really invites the public and Bell customers in particular to tweet and make noise about mental health. And then Bell has a promise that they back all of those interactions with a financial contribution into a giant pool, and then they choose nonprofits and other sort of important initiatives identified by them, and they invest into those initiatives to help ramp up capacities within mental health care. What's interestingly not talked a lot about in Bell Let's Talk, and I should say I am not a Bell employee. I was involved in some of the years with Bell Let's Talk, and I have talked to Bell employees. So this is where this perspective comes from. Bell employees really felt like they were thrown under the bus with the Bell Let's Talk campaign for some of its early years, because here you had a company that was investing significant resources into the public side of its awareness around mental health, but at the same time is in an incredibly stressful industry. Telecommunications, call center employees, these are very difficult jobs. Some of us maybe can relate to being a little bit heated calling our telecom companies at some point. And yet that's, another Canadian on that other side of the phone. And here was Bell doing this huge campaign around bringing awareness to mental health, but they weren't investing in their employees. They weren't investing in greater mental health support internally. And so that's really one of my first challenges to all of you. And this is my somewhat heated comment in the description for this session. Like, there's good intentioned people that want to make a difference in loneliness, want to do something in mental health. But so often when we think about that change initiative, it's always an outward facing initiative. Here, all of you represent varying sized organizations. Imagine if you created change just within all of your organizations, the number of lives that that would impact. And then the next question is then, well, how do you scale that? Business startup talk coming out here real loud and clear, to then go public, to then go to a broader audience. How do your employees potentially be your early adopters? Arguably, your employees possibly are the people that you have the highest engagement with. Hopefully, you have a high engagement with them. So that's an opportunity for you to learn from some of the challenges that Bell Let's Talk has had. The next group that I want to talk about, actually this is specifically a BC-based organization, Heads Up Guys. They started out of UBC. They've sort of expanded beyond the borders of UBC, specifically addressing men's health, men's mental health. And one of the elements of their work that I want to bring attention to is, so again, they are very much a knowledge-based organization. And as you sort of do your environmental scans, you'll probably come across this a lot. There's a lot of knowledge translation that's out there, talking about mental health, talking about loneliness, different demographics, different ethnicities, and targeting those different groups. But there's not a lot of that sort of support resource. And so Heads Up Guys wanted to lean into this, but they recognize their limitations. They're a nonprofit organization. They don't have a large clinical team. They can't be direct clinical care. And so in a number of their campaigns, they leaned into who are the supporters of the men and boys that we want to reach. So they targeted significant others. It was a little bit, heteronormative in the sense that they charged, targeted females to reach their male partners, but really, really effective campaign. It resonated with a lot of people into equipping those peripheral people in men's lives with the tools and the language to start a conversation. How do you help somebody who's experiencing loneliness, experiencing early stages of a mental illness or mental health challenge, in seeking support? Well, the number one thing is building a bridge and building a connection to them so that they feel confident they're not alone in that journey that they're about to embark on. So when thinking about loneliness, when thinking about mental health, try to look broader than the target audience that you want to support. Who is surrounding that person or potentially can surround that person? Can be incredibly meaningful and effective. And what you're tapping into is peer support. It allows you, many of the organizations here, I probably fall into similar categories. You're not direct care provider healthcare organizations. And so if through your initiative, you can tap into peer support, then you can have this dynamic that's a little bit deeper than just informing people about loneliness or informing people about mental health. A startup that I did work with, in all transparency, another Vancouver-based tech company here, really a fantastic organization in the fintech space. Bench did a really cool thing, leveraging and talking about that internal change management. They're a fintech company. They provide bookkeeping services to small businesses, and they built a mental health guide, and they disseminated it to all their employees. And they did roundtables with all their employees, because I know I helped facilitate them. And they really leaned into that internal community. And then they turned around and they made it the worst kept secret. And they amplified it out to all these other startups within their network, previous Techstars companies and things like that, and said like, hey, even if you're not a healthcare company, you need to worry and respond to the health of your employees. And here's a really tangible way that you can do this. Embrace this guide, put it together, have meaningful engagement, create meaningful community and discussion within your organizations around mental health. It was coincidentally at a time where there was a number of headlines coming out, just really pinpointing the incredible crisis that exists within the startup community around mental health. It was really initiated out of tragedy. Unfortunately, so much media is. There was notable CFO, CTOs in significant Silicon Valley startups that lost their lives to suicide. And then it started to come out like, wow, they struggled with bipolar for years. And because of stigma within the startup space, didn't verbalize it, didn't talk about it, were praised when they were in a manic state of bipolar. They were like, wow, they could code for 3 days straight and they created wonderful products and things like that. And then they had to shelter themselves and they had to hide themselves when they were in a depression and they were really struggling. So again, I love the Bench's example of being not a health tech company, but definitely creating positive waves that way. So now it's your turn. I know we're going to be coming up on time here really quick, and I do want to leave time for some engagement. I already see some messages in the chat, but super quick, some of those key points here. So as you're going to go into that design phase, what is your team's strength? Are you a bench in the sense that you could be a really good communicator? Can you consolidate information that's really fragmented on this topic? And then can you project it to a specific audience, maybe starting internally and then going more broadly? Who are you trying to help? That is so important. I think it's easy to think about like boiling the ocean and be like, loneliness, we're gonna help like Canada, we're gonna help Canadians, we're gonna help young people. I really encourage you to get more specific than that. Probably speaking to the choir for so many of you and who are coming from the marketing agency. Find your niche. Who is that, really narrow target audience? Who are your early adopters of that MVP going to be? And then stop. Environmental scan. That was my hammer time reference. Definitely go and take the time to look who else is doing what you're potentially considering doing. Please don't just go create somebody else's wheel. There is just so much duplication that happens when there is such a great opportunity for collaboration. And I know in these hackathons, it's intense, it's short, and you got to like pump something out really quickly. Find that dedicated team member who could do some cold reach outs and just try to make a connection with somebody. I highly recommend it. Having been in hackathon style things before, it's usually something that gives you the edge in that judging panel as well. So if you want to win, go find collaborators and go make sure that you've really shown, hey, we've looked into this. Doing so, you can more easily identify those facilitators and barriers that are going to come into play as you're going about creating your change. And then, of course, I can't stress it enough, collaborate, 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 find those stakeholders. Go and tap into your employees, go tap into local people within your social circle, because this is a human challenge. And if we're not invoking human-centered design to address it, to solve it, we're already failing. And so never forget the people that at the end of the day are going to be impacted, and never forget as organizations, the people that work day and night for your organizations and what the potential effects could be depending on what you choose to do as an organization. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing and we'll go back to being personable again. We're really excited to jump into some quick questions.
Aidan, that's super interesting and so many levels for me. Maybe I'll just invite this question and folks can jump in. First off, I wanted to say that there was a lot of thank you for sharing your own personal experience and lived experience at the beginning. That was very well appreciated by the group. So I just wanted to call that out. The thing that kind of pops out in your talk, just with dealing with personal health care issues, is advocacy and that by the individual. And so my question would be, do you know how to get people to advocate for themselves, or what might encourage that first step? Because it can't just be these really smart folks are going to come up with a solution and then we're going to create an event and then it's going to solve all the problems, or at least be a potential solution. But we also need, there's this other part is that the folks that we want to engage, we want to bring out of social isolation. How do we get them to take a step? How do we get them to advocate for themselves?
Love that question. As a recent father to a 14-month-old, I'm going to use the cliche term baby steps, super important here. I think the greatest opportunity that all of you folks have is when you're crafting your solution, your idea, how do you build natural steps into it for participation? Really what I hear in your question is, and you're absolutely right, in loneliness, and Dr. Fengen was also talking about this, jumping somebody into being a full advocate day one, that's very unrealistic. What's the smallest ask that you can have to have that person engage with a community or engage in the dialogue or conversation that you're having? I think that was so powerful. For me, it was little volunteer roles that I had with Kids Help Phone. I went and did like some of their helped them with some of their walks and things like that. I was somebody in the back area, and not visual or not taking a stage in public speaking by any means, but it was an opportunity for me to start interfacing with like-minded community members. So just think about those like stages of engagement. I think would be super important in that regard.
I guess I think of it as like how I deal with my own personal health care. It's like I'll turn up at the emergency room at the hospital when it's really bad, right? I've severed my leg, and then I take the number of the emergency room instead of saying, hey, you know what, there's a real problem and I got to advocate for myself. How do we get these folks to maybe take that first step?
Yeah, driving that
Um,
proactiveness is super key there. I mean, I didn't really share much of my background. I've worked with our public health agency for over 10 years, both at BC Children's Hospital here in Vancouver, but other health networks and Canada Health Infoway nationally, in addition to being co-founder and CEO of Speakbox and a mental health startup, and doing public speaking. And so I know we're going to definitely run out of time, but I did want to mention that sort of that breadth of experience that I have. And I am one of those people that my cell phone number, my email are on that contact list for tomorrow's events. So definitely, if we don't get to anything, know that I'm always an open door. If you just want to talk about trends and things like that, I love those conversations and happy to try to make time.
do you know what, on that point, as the teams create a solution, should they be creating a solution with all these other organizations in mind? And are there some organizations that are already doing things that they can like actually look to and maybe reach out to get ideas from?
I think a low-hanging fruit opportunity there could be to build on and collaborate with an existing organization out there. One of those other sort of caveat challenges of the Bell Let's Talk campaign is that Bell would make this initial investment in things and then not follow through with additional support. And so there is a lot of initiatives at varying degrees, whether they're nonprofits or volunteer-led or even for-profit for that matter. Is there a way to lean into them and sort of fill a gap that they might be experiencing with a unique solution where you could, launch a, social campaign that brings more attention to the work that they're doing, and you sort of like build off of that foundation rather than starting from square one.
Excellent.